Tanse Toa. Hello and welcome. I'm Miurgen and I'm going to be painting a portrait today in Rebelle 8. I've got my reference image ready to go here and I'm going to open it up right next to my canvas in my workspace. From this window you can actually color pick directly from your reference image. It also lets you switch to black and white mode, which is super helpful for looking at your values. And of course you can flip and rotate your image as needed. And you can even overlay it directly onto your canvas itself. I'm going to go ahead and add a few guidelines using my reference image. I'm going to add a line for the eyes and the brow line, as well as a center line that runs down the center of the face through the bridge of the nose. I also find it helpful to get sort of the outline of the portrait, including the edges of the hair. This is basically the outer edges of the silhouette of the portrait. These guidelines will show up on your canvas in the corresponding area where your reference image is. And if you like, you can use the transform tool and adjust where your reference image is going to sit over your canvas. This is especially helpful for when you're working at a different scale than your reference image. Since the whole process for this painting from start to finish was about 5 or 6 hours, I will be speeding through quite a bit of it, but I will be slowing things down here and there just so I can go into more detail for certain sections. Usually before I start painting, I've already done a few sketch studies of my subject, just to get the pose right and study the shapes that I see in their face. I'm just sketching over the reference image to start with to get that larger silhouette kind of nailed down a bit. I don't recommend tracing the entire pose, as that could end up making things look a little stiff. I'll be using the marker tool and the painting and blending settings to start blocking in these dark areas of the portrait. Next, I'll be going in with the watercolor tool to further darken these areas. I like to have it set to paint and blend just so I can keep things pretty unrefined at this point. Adding a light background and the first layer of color to the light areas of the portrait. With a large brush again, I'm going to pick out a light color to block in the light areas of the skin. I usually go with something fairly neutral. Keep in mind that your highlights will sit on top of this color, so don't go too light. My main concern at this point is establishing the larger shapes, as well as the light and dark areas. For the hair and clothing, I like to mass in the general shapes as well. Again, with a sort of neutral tone. Generally, I'm picking the average color that I see. It is also worth noting, since I'm using these watercolor brushes quite a bit, that I'm hitting Shift D whenever I need to stop the diffusion. I'm going to add my lightest shade in just sort of large blocky areas. And I'm going to sneak in a few midtones that I see that are warmer transitions into these shadow areas. At this point, I'm not trying to paint the features individually. I'm more so trying to describe the form of the face. This part of the process usually looks pretty weird, but it's all about giving me a nice structure to work off of later on. I'm also going to go ahead and block in some things that I see in the background. I'm just going to use the watercolor brush for this because at this point, I don't need them to be very sharply defined, and the watercolor brush will have a bit of a softer effect. And whenever I need to, I'm holding shift so that I can paint a straight line. I'm going to switch to the oil and acrylic brushes, and with a filbert brush, I'm going to mark through the highlights. This will just add a little bit of texture as well to those highlighted areas and help them stand out a bit better. So you can tell I really like this filbert brush. And then once you're done with those guidelines, you can simply grab them and pull them off of the reference image to delete them. Whenever you're painting clothing that is white, try to pay attention to the temperature changes between the light areas and the shadow areas. Oftentimes, there's little hints of blue or yellow or purple that are hiding in there that help make things a little more interesting. As I touch up the background, I'm trying to keep my brush fairly large because I don't want to accidentally make things too detailed. The background and even the clothing is not really the focus of this portrait, so I'm going to make sure I don't put too much of my energy in these areas. And then we're going to further sculpt out this form by adding the transition colors between the light and dark shades. Most often, these will be located on the side of the nose, beneath the brows, the sides of the face. What we're doing here is describing the different planes of the face. We're taking this large flat area and we're giving it 3D form. Now that the light areas have a touch of dimension, I'm going to go ahead and switch to a slightly smaller brush and do some refining. I'm taking my darkest value and I'm pushing my sculpt a bit further. I'm also going to use this to add some further dimension to the hair. I'm not too concerned about details just yet. As we touch up refining our sculpt, I'm going to pay close attention to where my hard and soft edges are. For the sides of the face, the hard edges are typically at points where there's little roundness to the form, or where the transition to the next plane of the face is hidden from your view. Your eyes see round forms as having softer edges. Areas with hair and clothing are usually quite soft as well. You can use the paint and blend mode to create a softer look without changing the brushes. For areas of the skin where veins are a bit visible, such as on the hands, I'm going to use a bit of a gray color, and this will just give the effect of blue veins. For the hands, my focus is mainly those hard and soft edges and the changes in temperature. As I define the eyes, I'm careful not to make the whites of the eyes too light. Generally, the whites of the eyes shouldn't be lighter than your lightest skin tone. For darker hair, oftentimes we're not changing too much from those first marks that we did when we were establishing the darker areas at the beginning of the portrait. But I will add some slight color variations. Usually this is sort of a dark blue if I'm painting black hair. And I like to keep the highlights pretty subtle, and they should generally follow the shape of the hairstyle. So I'm actually going to slow down here and let you see what the actual speed of rendering is at this point. I'm going in with a bristle brush and carefully adding in some highlights. I'm also keeping the side of her face that is in shadow pretty undefined. And sometimes I have to go in and make small adjustments using the liquify tool. Because this bristle brush has an impasto effect, they are going to stand out quite a bit against the rest of the painting. So I am going to use this pretty sparingly. I find that as you're working on portraits especially, the more restraint you show in the details that you choose, the more important those details that you leave in become. For me, the eyes are always going to be the most important part of the portrait, so I will tend to give most of my attention in this area. But I'll usually pick one eye especially and give that one the most detail. I just think it makes it look a little bit more natural. I think by giving just enough information to your audience, something really interesting happens where they become more involved as a participant of the painting. I think portraits are really fun for this reason because the human mind doesn't seem to need as much information as you might think to decide that it knows what's happening. So it kind of ends up being this little game of how little information can I provide for you to understand what I'm depicting. I think with these sped up time lapses, it's easy to lose sight of how slow the process can actually be. There's a lot going on as you're making these very intentional choices. You're thinking about the reference image, you're thinking about your painting as it looks now, and you're thinking about the end goal, what you're envisioning. And on top of that, you're coordinating your movements with your brush. The process is very thoughtful and it can be very slow at times. And while I'm in a huge rush, especially at the beginning to get things blocked out and situated, I do really enjoy this part of the painting that can be just very thoughtful and slow. I find it really relaxing. All that being said, I'm going to go ahead and speed through the rest of this part as we're still only halfway through. As I render out the hair, I'm going to use this rough oily brush. I really like using this brush for hair because of its soft bristly effects. And I'm going to be careful not to add too many hair strands as we go, otherwise it'll just look a little bit too messy. And I'm also going to refine the shape of the hair by kind of punching out areas of the background that are poking through. This will kind of help define things like curls that are happening. I find that if you want to keep the hair looking sort of on the softer side, you'll want to keep your values pretty limited in these light areas and not too defined. You're not looking to clearly mark out every single hair strand. Just like the rest of the portrait, I'm mostly focusing on the form of the hairstyle rather than every individual strand. And then for the earring, I'm going to go in with one of our bristle brushes here. And I'm going to start marking out the general shape of the earring. It's okay if this isn't perfectly exact right now because I can see that this earring rests against her dark hair and I can kind of touch that up later if I need to using a darker color. I also want to be able to go in with something brighter to really make that earring shine. So I'm keeping this as neutral as possible still. So let's go ahead and speed things up. Again, I'm going to finish adding those highlights to the earring. And then I'm going to start using some different brushes to define the clothing. I'm going to use this smooth knife. I like this one because it's really blocky and adds just a touch of impasto. It's really nice for getting those uh, clothing details. As we near our final touch-ups for the face area, I am trying to be careful not to overwork my painting. Oftentimes, if you end up refining things a little bit too much, it kind of loses that loose, expressive feel that comes with painterly portraits, and it can end up looking quite stiff and rigid. For the details on the clothing, I'm trying to keep it as undetailed as possible. I don't want the clothing to be the main focus of this portrait, but I do want it to look good. So I'm focusing on adding just enough detail that it looks like clothing. Usually, this means making things look like the right texture. For example, with her skirt, it should look like it's sort of light and flowy. And on her shirt, it kind of looks like she's got some lace and frills going on. So I'm going to focus mostly on getting the texture down in those areas. So for softer clothing like the skirt, I'm going to be using softer brushes. I don't want to use anything too scrunkily textured or it's going to give me the wrong effect. And oftentimes, as you're working in other areas and your eyes take a break from previous sections that you've worked on, you begin to notice little things that you want to change. So, what ends up happening is I'll kind of return to the face after working in a different section again and again as I work on the portrait just to make little tiny changes as we go along. Something else I'd like to mention, especially with the impasto brushes, is to pay attention to the direction of your brush stroke. Generally, you'll want to follow the form with your brush stroke. Otherwise, the texture can be a little bit distracting and disrupt the illusion. Since I already know where my darkest areas are, and I've established where the areas that are in shadow are, I'm trying to be mindful that I stay within those parameters. As I'm going through and refining certain areas, I might also actually simplify certain things. I might be working in a specific spot and decide that this can actually be described easily with just one brushstroke or two brushstrokes, and simpler is always going to be better. For her lace collar, since I've already added that texture in, all I have to do is punch in a few holes using a dark color, and that illusion of lace is complete. I always save details like buttons for last, just so I'm not repainting them over and over again as I'm going through that section. As we reach our final touches, I will be doing a lot of zooming in and out, just deciding what details I'd like to keep in, what last minute adjustments I need to make. And a lot of this is going to be for the background. You don't have to work in one layer like I am here. In fact, for this part of the background, it might have been easier to have more than one layer. But I'm still being careful here not to make things way too detailed so that they don't draw attention away from my subject. My preference for the background would be to keep my brushstrokes as limited as possible, but I think I got a little bit carried away with these wood details. In fact, as I added these little button effects, I ended up going back over them with a watercolor brush just to kind of soften them out a little bit more. And then for the spots where I want it to be highlighted, I'm making sure to use a brush that has a little bit more of an impasto effect just to help it stand out a bit. I did notice that the part of the couch that is on her right side is a little bit less in focus on the picture, so I'm trying to replicate that here by kind of softening these edges with a watercolor brush. And then I'm going to do one more pass over just to bring back a few more of those fold details. For the embellishments on this pillow in the background, the grunge brush is perfect. I'm going to use these various textures on the knife brushes. I'm really enjoying pulling out all the different textures with these different brushes for the background details. With these texture brushes, it really doesn't take much to give something the effect of velvet or embroidery. And for those details on the wallpaper, I'm kind of just making them up as we go along. I also decided that I wanted to adjust the lighting a little bit so that it's colder like it is in the reference image. So for that, I'm going to make a new layer with a soft light filter and adjust the lighting using an airbrush. And of course, I'm going to realize I forgot to paint the pillow that she's resting on. So I'm going to add that in. And I'll make a few last adjustments to my background, and that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed painting it, and take care. Bye.